Number 1. Paul Flores. For 25 years, a young woman's disappearance haunted a small California college town, and the man responsible walked free among the people searching for her. Kristen Smart was 18 years old, a freshman at California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. On the night of May 24, 1996, she walked back to her dorm after an off-campus party. She never arrived. A fellow student, Paul Flores, was one of the last people seen with her, walking her partway home. After that, nothing. No body, no confession, no trace. What followed was one of the most frustrating missing persons investigations in California history. Search parties combed hillsides, cadaver dogs were brought in. The Smart family pleaded publicly, year after year, for any answer. Flores was named early as a suspect. Investigators noted inconsistencies in his story, and a search of his dorm room in the days after Kristen vanished purportedly turned up a blood stain he could not explain. But without a body, prosecutors said they didn't have enough to charge him. He went on with his life. He moved, he worked, he stayed silent. Then, in 2020, investigators returned to Flores's father's property in Arroyo Grande with new search warrants in modern forensic techniques. Cadaver dogs alerted beneath a deck. Soil samples taken from that spot tested positive for human decomposition residue. In 2021, Paul Flores was finally arrested and charged with Kristen's murder. His father, Ruben Flores, was charged as an accessory, accused of helping move and conceal her body decades earlier. The 2022 trial revealed a portrait pieced together from witness testimony spanning a quarter-century. Fellow students who said Flores had bragged about or hinted at what happened that night. Women who came forward describing past assaults, a pattern investigators argued showed predatory behavior long before Kristen disappeared. Prosecutors argued Flores killed her, likely in a sexual assault that went wrong, then enlisted his father to dispose of her remains. The jury convicted Paul Flores of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. His father was convicted of being an accessory after the fact and received a suspended sentence. To this day, despite the extensive 2020 search and the soil evidence, Kristen Smart's remains have never been recovered. Her family was finally given a verdict, but never a body to bring home. A verified but little-known fact, investigators believe Flores moved Kristen's body more than once over the years, each time staying one step ahead of where searches were focused, meaning the truth may still be buried somewhere California has never thought to look.
Number 2. Cary Stayner. Yosemite is one of the most photographed places in America. Granite cliffs, waterfalls, postcard silence. In February 1999, that silence hid something no one expected to find inside it. Carol Sund, her daughter Julie, and family friend Silvina Peloso had checked into the Cedar Lodge Motel just outside the park, planning a few days of sightseeing before flying home. They never checked out. Their rental car was found burned in a remote forest area weeks later, with no bodies inside. The disappearance triggered one of the largest search efforts in California history. FBI agents, National Guard helicopters, and a $250,000 reward offered by the Sund family themselves. Investigators initially zeroed in on the wrong men. A group of local suspects were named publicly, their lives upended by accusation before being cleared months later. The real killer was someone almost no one had looked at, Cary Stayner, the live-in handyman at the very motel where the women had been staying. Stayner had a quiet, unremarkable presence at Cedar Lodge. He fixed things. He kept to himself. What almost no one knew was that his family had already been marked by tragedy and trauma in ways that shaped him. His younger brother, Stephen Stainer, had been kidnapped as a child in the 1970s and held captive for 7 years before escaping, a case that drew national attention. Carey, by his own later admission, had grown up resentful and overshadowed by his brother's ordeal and the family's unraveling in its aftermath. In July 1999, months after the Sund Peloso murders, Stainer abducted and murdered Yosemite naturalist Joey Armstrong near her cabin in the park. This time, witnesses and physical evidence moved fast. FBI agents arrested him days later at a nudist colony in Wawona. Once in custody, Stainer confessed in chilling, methodical detail, not just to Armstrong's murder, but to the deaths of Carol and Julie Sund in Silvina Peloso months earlier. He described his actions with an unsettling calm that investigators and psychologists found difficult to reconcile with the violence itself. Stainer pleaded guilty in the Sund Peloso case to avoid a state death sentence, receiving life without parole, but a separate federal trial for Armstrong's murder still ended in a death sentence, which he currently appeals from death row. A verified but little-known fact, in his confession, Stainer told investigators he had thought about committing murder for years before 1999, meaning the women who crossed his path that February weren't victims of a sudden break, but of a plan that had been waiting for an opportunity. Number 3. Richard Allen Davis. A slumber party, 3 girls laughing in a bedroom, and a stranger who was already inside the house before anyone knew he was there. On the night of October 1, 1993, Polly Klaas was hosting 2 friends for a sleepover at her mother's home in Petaluma. A man entered through an unlocked door, produced a knife, tied up the 2 other girls, and took Polly. Her mother was asleep in another room. The other girls freed themselves almost immediately, but Polly was gone. What followed was a search effort that became a defining moment in California's relationship with child safety. Thousands of volunteers organized search parties. Polly's face appeared on flyers across the state and eventually the country. Celebrities and national media picked up the story. For 2 months, the case became a symbol of a community's refusal to give up. Richard Allen Davis was, by that point, already well known to the justice system, a career criminal with a long record of kidnapping, assault, and parole violations stretching decades. He had been released from prison only months before Polly's abduction. When he was pulled over for an unrelated vehicle issue near the search area shortly after the kidnapping, an officer let him go, not yet connecting him to the case. A missed encounter that, in hindsight, haunted investigators. Davis was eventually arrested in Ukiah after his truck was found stuck in mud, abandoned near where he'd left physical evidence behind. Forensic links connected him to the crime, and, under questioning, he led investigators to Polly's body, which had been left off a rural highway. The trial in 1996 was emotionally volatile. Davis showed little remorse in court, at one point making an obscene gesture toward the gallery during his sentencing, an act that drew national outrage and reinforced public perception of him as remorseless. He was convicted of kidnapping and first-degree murder with multiple special circumstances and sentenced to death. The case's impact went well beyond the courtroom. Polly's murder, combined with Davis's extensive prior record, became a driving force behind California's 3 strikes law, which mandated harsher sentencing for repeat violent offenders, a direct legislative response to the public's anger that a man with his history had been free at all. Davis remains on death row in California to this day, decades after his conviction. An officially unanswered question that still lingers in the case: had that traffic stop near the search area gone differently, had the officer recognized him that night, could Polly Klaas have been found alive? Number 4. Phil Spector. He had once been one of the most powerful men in music, a producer credited with shaping the sound of an entire era. By 2003, behind the walls of his California mansion, that legacy collided with a death that would define the rest of his life. In the early hours of February 3, 2003, actress Lana Clarkson was found dead from a single gunshot wound inside Phil Spector's home in Alhambra. Clarkson had been working as a hostess at the House of Blues earlier that night and had gone home with Spector after her shift. Spector's chauffeur, waiting outside, told police he heard a gunshot and then saw Spector emerge holding a gun, purportedly saying something to the effect that he had just shot someone. Spector's defense argued Clarkson's death was a suicide, pointing to her career struggles and personal life. Prosecutors countered with a pattern that several women who had previously been involved with Spector described independently to investigators. Accounts of being threatened, held against their will, or having guns brandished at them during disputes, none of which had ever resulted in charges before Clarkson's death. That pattern, prosecutors argued, made it implausible that Clarkson, a woman with no documented history of suicidal behavior, had used a gun that wasn't her own in a home that wasn't hers, hours after meeting its owner. The first trial in 2007 ended in a hung jury. Spector's wealth and legal team mounted an aggressive defense, and the case became a media spectacle, dissecting both forensic evidence, including blood spatter analysis disputed by experts on both sides, and Spector's increasingly erratic public behavior, including elaborate wigs and behavior in court that drew tabloid scrutiny. A second trial in 2009 ended differently. The jury convicted Spector of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 19 years to life in California State Prison. What made the case resonate beyond true crime circles was the dissonance at its core. A man whose work had shaped some of the most celebrated recordings in American music, undone by a private pattern of behavior toward women that had quietly followed him for decades before anyone outside his circle took it seriously. Spector died in prison in January 2021, never having been released. A verified but little-known fact: at the time of his arrest, investigators found Spector had a documented history of being investigated for similar incidents involving firearms and women going back to the 1970s, none of which had ever previously led to prosecution. Number 5. Scott Peterson. It started as a missing persons case that captured the entire country. It ended as a story about how far a husband would go to hide what he'd done, and how thoroughly he tried to perform innocence while doing it. On Christmas Eve 2002, Lacey Peterson, 8 months pregnant with the couple's first child, was reported missing by her husband Scott. He told police she had gone for a walk with their dog that morning and never returned. In the days that followed, Scott appeared on camera, tearful, pleading for his wife's safe return, even as he gave media interviews from the home they shared. But almost immediately, details began to surface that didn't fit. Scott had told police he had gone fishing that morning, alone in a small boat on San Francisco Bay, more than 90 miles from home, despite having no apparent history of fishing as a hobby. Investigators later learned he had been having an affair with a woman named Amber Frey for weeks before Lacey disappeared, and that he had told Frey he was unmarried, a lie that unraveled once Frey saw news coverage of the missing pregnant wife and contacted police herself, sharing recorded phone calls with Scott from after Lacey's disappearance. For months, the case played out in the open, with search volunteers combing the bay and surrounding areas, while Scott continued his public displays of concern. The break came in April 2003, when the remains of Lacey and her unborn son, whom she and Scott had planned to name Connor, washed ashore near the same stretch of bay where Scott claimed to have been fishing, far from where investigators believed her body would have ended up if she had simply vanished from a walking trail. Scott Peterson was arrested days later, found near a golf course in San Diego, having dyed his hair and grown a goatee, with thousands of dollars in cash and his brother's ID in his car. Preparations, prosecutors argued, were for fleeing to Mexico. The 2004 trial drew massive national attention. Prosecutors built a case around the affair, the implausible fishing story, and the location of the remains, arguing Scott had killed Lacey at home and disposed of her body from his boat. The jury convicted him of first-degree murder for Lacey and second-degree murder for their unborn son. He was sentenced to death. In 2020, the death sentence was overturned on appeal due to errors in jury selection, though his murder conviction stood. He was resentenced to life without parole in 2021. A 2024 push for a new trial based on alternate suspect theories was ultimately denied. A verified but little-known fact: cement anchors matching ones missing from Scott's warehouse were found near where Lacey's body surfaced. Physical evidence, prosecutors argued, directly contradicted his story and tied him to the exact method of disposal. Number 6. Christopher Dorner. For 9 days in February 2013, large parts of Southern California existed in a state of lockdown fear as a former police officer turned fugitive systematically hunted the people he believed had wronged him, and law enforcement scrambled to figure out who might be next. Christopher Dorner was a former Los Angeles Police Department officer who had been fired in 2008 following a disciplinary case in which he accused a training officer of excessive force, an accusation a department review found unsubstantiated. Dorner maintained the firing was unjust and racially motivated. He spent years afterward unsuccessfully appealing his termination through the legal system. In early February 2013, Dorner published a lengthy manifesto online naming specific LAPD officers, supervisors, and their family members he held responsible for his firing, along with explicit threats of violence against them. Days later, the killing began. Monica Kwan, the daughter of a former LAPD captain who had represented Dorner during his termination case, was shot and killed along with her fiancé in their car in Irvine. Police quickly connected the attack to Dorner's manifesto and identified him as the primary suspect. What followed was an unprecedented manhunt. Dorner, a trained Navy reservist with firearms expertise, evaded capture for days, during which he shot 2 more police officers, killing one in an ambush in Riverside. The scale of the threat, a man with military training, intimate knowledge of police tactics, and a detailed kill list, led the LAPD to assign protective details to dozens of officers and their families across the region. An extraordinary security response. The case took on additional controversy when, during the search, LAPD officers mistakenly fired on a vehicle they believed belonged to Dorner, wounding 2 innocent women delivering newspapers, an incident that drew significant criticism in a later settlement. The manhunt ended in the mountain community of Big Bear, where Dorner had been hiding in a cabin near where his burned-out truck was found days earlier. A cleaning crew discovered him, leading to a standoff with law enforcement at a different cabin he had taken over. During the standoff, the cabin caught fire. Accounts differ on exactly how, and Dorner was found dead inside, from what was determined to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The case forced a public reckoning within the LAPD, prompting an independent review of Dorner's original 2008 termination case, though the department ultimately stood by its original findings. A verified but little-known fact: in the days before the standoff, Dorner had reportedly been hiding in plain sight near the search perimeter for nearly a week, surviving in a cabin close to where searchers had already passed, meaning the manhunt, covering hundreds of square miles, may have come within feet of him long before the final confrontation. Number 7. Jesse James Hollywood. He was 20 years old, already a small-time drug dealer with a reputation for paranoia and control. When he decided someone owed him a debt, he didn't go after the man directly. He went after that man's little brother instead. A decision that would end in a killing so senseless it became almost impossible for investigators, and later the public, to comprehend. In August 2000, Jesse James Hollywood believed a rival, Ben Markowitz, owed him a significant drug debt and had vandalized his car. Rather than confronting Ben, Hollywood and several associates abducted Ben's 15-year-old half-brother, Nicholas Markowitz, off a street in West Hills. For the first day, witnesses later said, Nicholas wasn't treated like a typical kidnapping victim. He was taken to parties, allowed to interact with people, even seen smoking and talking with their captors. Several people who crossed paths with him during this time later said he didn't seem to fully grasp the danger he was in. That changed when Hollywood, according to testimony, realized the kidnapping had become a felony with serious legal consequences and panicked over how exposed he and his associates now were. Rather than releasing Nicholas, prosecutors say Hollywood ordered his murder to eliminate him as a witness. On August 9, 2000, Nicholas was taken to a remote area in Santa Barbara County's Lizard's Mouth region, shot multiple times, and buried in a shallow grave. Hollywood fled the country almost immediately, eventually settling under a false identity in Brazil, where he lived openly for nearly 5 years, while a warrant for his arrest remained active in the United States. During that time, several of his associates were arrested, tried, and convicted in connection with Nicholas's murder, while Hollywood himself became the subject of national fugitive coverage. His case later loosely inspired the film Alpha Dog.
In 2005, acting on a tip, U.S. authorities located and extradited Hollywood back to California. His 2009 trial centered on whether he personally pulled the trigger or simply ordered the killing. Testimony from co-defendants pointed to Hollywood directing the murder rather than carrying it out himself, though one associate was identified as the shooter. The jury convicted Hollywood of first-degree murder with a special circumstance of kidnapping, and he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. What makes this case the most disturbing of all 7 isn't the brutality of the act alone, it's the casualness that preceded it. For nearly 24 hours, a 15-year-old was kept among people his own age, treated almost like a guest, before the calculation shifted and his life became a liability to be erased. The betrayal wasn't sudden, it was deliberated. A verified but little-known fact, several of the young people who spent time with Nicholas during his final day later testified they had the opportunity to help him escape or call for help and did not. A detail that expanded the case's reckoning beyond Hollywood alone and into the question of collective moral failure among an entire group of peers.